is an associate professor of urban ed at Temple University. She holds a joint PhD in education and sociology, very interesting background. Her research examines the intersection between social policy, race, class, and the lived experiences of people targeted by policy initiatives. She's also studied dynamics of race, class, and school reform at the local level, specifically around processes of middle-class investment in urban public schools. And she was a National Academy of Education Spencer postdoc. We may have met there, actually. And she's the author of Marketing Schools, Marketing Cities, Who Wins and Who Loses When Schools Become Urban Amenities. Today her talk is Opportunities Lost, Disconnections Between Parenting Education Programs and Mothers' Experiences with Poverty. So thank you very much for coming.
Hi everyone, thank you very much for having me today. I'm really excited to be here, in part because I'm sharing some work that's in progress. It's data that I collected during my Spencer postdoc and that I've been kind of mulling over ever since. So I'm going to share it with you, and I'm really interested in your thoughts and suggestions because, as you'll see, there are a lot of ideas going on in here. So what I'd like to do is give my presentation, but if there are clarifying questions that you want to ask, please just stop me. Because not everyone's that familiar with parenting education, which is, it's a whole kind of endeavor in the field of education that lots of K-12 people don't know about. So I'm more than happy to take questions that if people have burning things to figure out. Okay. So parenting education programs operate in schools, community centers, daycares, and other settings all over the country. The goal of parenting classes is basically to teach parents, especially low-income mothers, the kinds of parenting skills and attitudes that tend to be associated with improved outcomes for kids. So parenting education is sort of one of a bundle of strategies that people are talking about as ways to close the achievement gap and the opportunity gap between low-income and middle-class kids. If we can get low-income parents to do things differently, that's sort of the thinking, then their kids will have better opportunities. So among other things, parenting education classes teach moms to be loving and affectionate with their children, to avoid corporal punishment, so it's a lot about nonviolent approaches to discipline, to have developmentally appropriate expectations, so to say, like, okay, my kid is 2 and he's acting up, I need to, I know that that's just what 2-year-olds do, rather than saying that there's something wrong with your child. And to promote children's cognitive and literacy development. So, my pictures are meant to sort of suggest that kids, you're supposed to play with your kids, you're supposed to read to your kids, you're supposed to talk to them, you're supposed to reason with them. These are all kind of the driving ideas in parenting education. Unfortunately, though, research on the outcomes of these classes has been mixed at best. Most programs, especially those that happen in centers or classrooms, don't really have much of an impact on parents' beliefs or practices. Yet these programs are really widespread. It's part of the DHS or Child Protection System, and they're all over, costing millions of dollars each year. Now there are programs that have been shown to be more effective, which are the home visiting, like the home visiting nurse programs, and those have been shown to have better impact. And I have in my study, I have some data that I collected at that kind of a program, but that's not what I'm talking about today. I'm talking about classes. Okay, so today I'm going to draw from ethnographic data I collected at 2 parenting education classes. And I'm going to suggest that a major problem with both the policy and the scholarly conversation about parenting education is that it's really focused on the individuals. So missing from this conversation is an understanding of parenting as highly contextualized, right? Like you parent in a context. And it's heavily shaped by structural forces. So what parents are able to do is heavily shaped by things like their class status, their race, their gender, all these other things that we know impact people's lives.
What was the verb you used there?
Impact?
No, before that. That race, class are...
Gender?
They're tied to...
Structure?
Contextual? Or contextual?
Contextual.
Yeah.
I use a lot of verbs.
Okay. I know. I'm trying to sort them out.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm a sociologist, so I think of structural forces. So the ways in which these kind of big things shape our lives.
Okay.
And so also missing from parenting education programs is any kind of critique of systemic poverty and racism, right? So the assumption often seems to be that, which is consistent with the ways that the United States in general deals with poverty. The assumption seems to be that we just need to fix the individuals, right? It's a way of locating the problem in the individuals. You know, we need to change what the parents do. So, you know, maybe for these reasons, my data show a really strong disconnection between what the classes are doing and what the parents are dealing with. So the moms liked the classes. Some of them said they were useful, but few reported actually learning anything or changing their behaviors in any way as a result, even though, you know, they spent a year once a week in these programs. So I'm not trying to say that, like, this is a terrible idea and we shouldn't be providing parenting education. I think it does some good for some people, but I guess what I want to argue today is that my data show that in the case of parenting education programs and maybe other kinds of interventions that are designed to change the behaviors of low-income people, that if you don't account for issues of structure and context, these things are probably going to fall short. So the theoretical grounding of this study is quite different from most of the research that's out there on parenting education. So I'm a sociologist, right? So unlike a lot of people who study parenting, I tend to think that what parents do is highly contextualized and socially contingent, right? So whereas a lot of the research on parenting education says, well, this practice, reading to your kids, not hitting your kids, this is associated with positive outcomes, so we should make everybody do that, or we should encourage everybody to do that. I kind of say, well, you know, it's all contingent. Our notion of what counts as good parents now is different from what counted as being a good parent 100 years ago. So let's kind of take a step back from this way of thinking about, you know, that there's one way to do things. I'm also, and this is the idea I'm playing with for today, I'm also really interested in placing parenting education within a broader context, historical context of how the United States deals with poverty. And I'm drawing from Michael Katz's work here, the historian Michael Katz, who talks about in the United States that we have this strong tradition of treating poverty as a matter of an individual failing, right? We individualize poverty. We don't pay attention to structure and economic arrangements. We think about what's wrong with poor people. So I'm obviously paying attention to structure and context, and I'm interested in the ways, I'm thinking of these parents as actively thinking and engaging at all times. So the intersections between what they're taking in and their own lives, right? Is it meeting their needs? Is it not? And then what kind of meanings are they making in their experiences? So just to get back to this social policy question, a couple things are important to know in terms of the context. So as I said, we have tended in America to treat poverty as a problem of individuals. And in our discourse and policy making around poverty, we've tended to distinguish between the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. Now, different groups fell differently into those categories at different historical moments, but you could imagine, you know, children are usually deserving poor, maybe disabled people.
You mean undeserving?
No, children are deserving. Deserving of aid.
Oh, okay.
Oh. Sorry, yes.
I thought you
No, thank you. Deserving of aid. No. Right, okay. So this is why I need to be interrupted. So it's Michael Katz is making this distinction between people who society should help, the deserving poor, and people who don't really deserve help, the undeserving poor. So children, disabled people, they're deserving. You know, lazy people, teenage mothers, people who are immoral, people who have too many kids, those become undeserving. While we may not say that, right, in our policies, it's often kind of implicit. So that is, that's kind of an idea that I've got going on in my head. Another thing that's a little more concrete is that in the last 20-something years, we've seen this real shift in poverty policy away from cash assistance and towards social services that are really organized around making people self-sufficient and work-ready, right? So beginning with welfare reform. And so in the process, we see that the safety net, the services that are available to people, are much more fragmented and they're much less stable. So you've got all these various nonprofit agencies, some provide food, some provide training, some provide something else, and the moms are kind of running from one agency to another. And often the agencies are, their funding is is tenuous. So they may offer something this year and then they have to take it away. So this is sort of the context in which the moms that I've studied are living. So I'm just going to let you take a look at these research questions. So as you can see, I'm really interested in this intersection between what the programs are offering and how the moms are living and how they're experiencing it, and then what challenges they're dealing with in their daily lives. So in my larger study, I have 5 sites, and I have, I think, like over 50 hours of 50 interviews and 200 hours of observation. But here, I'm focusing on 2 sites that I call Morris and Second Chance. And both of them are programs that are run in schools for kids who have dropped out. So they're both in these kind of re-engagement schools. And the school contracts with this agency that sends instructors to do their parenting classes. So at Morris, the classes met once a week for an hour. Half of the time, the moms were in with the kids in a nursery, and then would go up to a classroom, and then the other half the time, they just went right to a classroom. At Second Chance, there was no nursery, and they just the parents met in a classroom with the instructor. So let's see, what else can I tell you? So the instructors were really interesting. At Morris, the instructor who asked to be called Mama Odette in my research, she was a middle-aged African-American woman, had 3 children. She was very maternal, as you can see by her name. She was also very Afrocentric. So she had this kind of familialism that was really important to her. She would sweep into the classroom and call the mothers her daughters, and she would hug them, and she was very warm. Miss Naomi at Second Chance was quite different, but also very friendly and accessible. She was probably in her mid-20s. She hadn't had children. She was much more sort of clinical in the way that she dealt with the parents. She was much more likely to follow the actual curriculum. Mama Odette didn't pay attention to the curriculum. And Miss Naomi had been trained as a health educator, had done sex ed for years, so she was very comfortable talking about human sexuality and kind of engaging with the moms around that stuff. And then to give you a sense of the data collection, so I went once a week or twice a week to Second Chance for a bulk of the school year. And I also collected program and instructional material. I did interviews. I collected program and instructional material, so I have the official curriculum that the instructors were using. I collected information that I'll show you in a minute about monthly incomes. This piece on transcription I want to flag. How many of you are qualitative researchers? Okay, so this happened that I've never had happen to me before. I wasn't aware of it. When I started going through my transcripts, I found errors, transcription errors, and multiple ones that changed the meaning. I had not had, has anyone had that experience? Okay, well I never had, and I'd never heard of anyone else who, so I ended up going back and re-listening and correcting all my interviews. Okay, it took like an extra 6 months. It was incredible. So now I tell all my students that they have to do that. I think it was particularly, there was like dialect issues, local names, but the striking thing, I mean I found errors, but the striking thing for me was they were so significant that someone would say, oh, I never did that, and the transcriptionist would write, I did that. Really big. So anyway, so I did that, and then I worked on coding. I collected all the data, but I did the analysis with graduate students, and so every interview observation was coded by 2 people. And then I did lots of different kinds of member checking that I'm happy to talk about. Okay, so just to give you a sense, here is one of the information forms that that I asked the interviewees to fill out, and I designed this form actually in consultation with the mothers in this class. So like I said, well, tell me what kinds of things help you survive. Where do you get income? And so they, these were the ones they suggested. They wanted me to add healthcare. They wanted me to add, do you smoke? I didn't put that. So anyway, this was, you can see that these moms really are poor. I mean, this mom needs $400 a month to meet her expenses. She has one daughter, and she only has $200. So these are people who are living really, really on the edge. Okay. So let's talk about what the classes actually did. So this kind of confusing Venn diagram is meant to show that there was this official curriculum, and then there was stuff that each instructor did. So the official curriculum covered things like communication skills, having good relationships with your kids, nonviolent discipline, big deal. Although more for Miss Naomi than Mama Odette, who was and then different kind of challenges of parenting, like discipline problems or temperament things. And then Miss Naomi at Second Chance, she also covered things like child development, brain development. She did a lot of sexual safety stuff. So this was still in the curriculum. And then she added to the curriculum, you should have 15 minutes of quality time every day with your kids. A whole thing about respecting children's temperament, that was important to her. Whereas Mama Odette, she talked about singing, reading, playing with the baby, much more than was actually in the curriculum in this program. Baby proofing was a big thing that she talked about. And then she had a lot of emphasis on speaking up for yourself. And both instructors also emphasized this thing about monitoring what kids see and hear. So not just in terms of media, but if you're having conflict in the home, watch out. If you're arguing with somebody, if kids are seeing inappropriate sexual behavior, you need to be on top of that. And then they talked about healthy foods. Okay, so in some ways the classes were helpful to the moms. For example, at Morris, Mama Odette consistently used positive and affirming language, reminding the mothers that they were good mothers doing the right things by their children. This was meaningful to the participants. So here's Brielle, an 18-year-old mother who was living in foster care. She said, nobody ever said that to me. It was like, well, we think you're a wonderful mother for like continuing school and doing what you're supposed to do. I was like, wow. So that touched me. That was important to them, that kind of affirmation. While Naomi did not create the same sort of connections with the mothers, she made sure the classes felt like a safe space. And these are moms who are dealing with a lot of things, don't always have wonderful support networks, so she made the classes feel like places where they could talk to each other. So one mother, Charmaine, noted that being able to talk about whatever and not fearing that it'll go around was helpful to her. So Miss Naomi made all the moms promise that it would be that what was said there would be left there, and that was important to Charmaine. So to mothers like Charmaine and Brielle, these classes meant an important, often unmet need for affirmation, social support, and a place to share. However, while parents appreciated these elements of the classes, they generally learned they generally noted that they didn't learn very much. So when I interviewed the moms, and this is actually across all my sites, I always say, so tell me what you learned in the class. And they'll be like, I learned a lot. I'll say, okay, great, can you tell me some specific things? And almost to a one, they really can't. And then I would sort of ask it another way, like, okay, maybe I'm just asking it wrong, so I would re-ask, like, oh, well, is there anything you do differently now? And they would say, oh, not really. So there wasn't a sense that they actually learned anything. So here's Wenda, who actually loved the classes, and she's going to show up again. She was a Morris mother. She said, we never stuck on one topic. So it's like I learned little pieces here and there, pieces and dabs here and there, but I never really learned. And she liked the classes, but there wasn't a sense that she got something out of them in terms of new material or new ideas or ways to do things. So next, I want to argue that one reason for this lack of impact could be a disconnection between what the moms are dealing with and the class material, especially the ongoing problems of living in pretty severe poverty. So making sure they had enough food and money for other basics was a challenge for most of the mothers in this study. For example, in response to an interview question about whether or not she ever ran out of food at the end of the month, Tania said, "At the end of the month, I run out of money at like the middle of the month, not at the end of the month." And then she laughed and she said, "When you got kids, you run out in the middle." And so I said, "So what about, like, what would you be doing?" And she said, "Eating little things like a little pizza or cheesesteak. We'll eat that, we'll share some French fries. Or the big things is rice, cook something that's in the house with some gravy or something. Little stuff." Yeah. A Morris mother who had, this is Wenda, who had just moved out of a homeless shelter a week before our interview. She had moved into a high-rise housing project, and when I went up to do the interview, she literally had 2 folding chairs, and that was it in her apartment, at least in the living room. She laughed ruefully about her end-of-the-month challenges, saying, "And that's when it's borrowing time." So here's another mother, Bernice. She's from Second Chance, and she faced similar issues. And I interviewed her when she was a student at Second Chance, and then I followed up with a number of mothers a year later. So this is her actually a year later. She's graduated. She was working. She wanted to work full-time. She couldn't get full-time hours, so she was part-time at a grocery store. And she was making less than $1,000 a month. So she said she ran short of money for food on a regular basis. When that happened, she said she and her toddler son would survive by eating probably some noodles or peanut butter and jelly sandwich or some cereal, but not like real food that sticks to you. Many of the moms talked about running out of formula, diapers, wipes, money for laundry, and skimping on meals. It was a pretty common, and I didn't know to ask it until when I started this research, because I just didn't think of it as somebody who's never had to worry about food. And it wasn't until I got in and had these conversations with the moms, I was like, "Oh my God, wait, you run out of food every month?" It's just so common. It's really powerful. Food scarcity is a really big deal. Okay, so parents' poverty also impacted their housing, which was a major issue for many of the mothers. They moved frequently. They often stayed with relatives where conditions could be pretty overcrowded. And sometimes they went to a shelter. So I'm going to give you sort of an extended vignette here. So in one class session at Second Chance that focused on family discipline and rules, parents began talking about challenges in their current living situation with other people eating their food. This is a big thing. So Sharina, a young woman who wore her hair in dark, heavy bangs and had a really intense expression on her face, she said, "There are lots of kids in my house. I be cussing. People eat my food I put in the fridge. They don't respect nothing. I went to Fridays with my daughter. We didn't eat our food there and we brought it home. Someone ate it. My mom said we should have just eaten it there." Other parents then chimed in, talking about their own experiences with their food being eaten, or people keeping their refrigerators locked. Some of the moms would have a small fridge that they would keep in their room, and they'd lock the door of their room so other people wouldn't eat their food. Another mom talked about growing up in foster care where the foster mother had a padlock on the refrigerator. So the instructor, Naomi, was listening to this, and she responded by saying that families should not be locking up food because we should have more respect. She then recounted how her mother would ask her and her sister what they wanted, so they would have their own food and not eat each other's. In response, another mother laughed, calling out, "Ain't no choosing in my house." Whereas Naomi is proposing a systematic way of ensuring that everyone had the food that they liked, the mother's responses suggested a level of scarcity and disorder, kind of chaos, that made such planning a luxury. So 2 things I think are worth noting, even in this little incident. One is a disconnection between the mother's experiences and the way that Miss Naomi sees things. And the second, that's more subtle, but I think really important, is Miss Naomi is reframing what the mothers are dealing with, that people, as a problem that results from scarcity, right? That people literally don't have enough food and will eat each other's, to one of personal failings, right? People don't have respect. So this is the kind of thing that happened a lot in these classes. For some parents, Housing instability literally meant they had nowhere to live or faced constant threats of eviction from landlords or from family members. If you're living with somebody and you do something that makes them mad, they can threaten to kick you out. So Taisha, who had moved multiple times since her daughter was born, she was currently living with her godmother, who was like a foster mom, but also her godmom. It was a complicated situation. And during the interview, I asked about her living situation, and she got this very pained look on her face, saying, so it's basically like I'm homeless, because every other day, she, her godmother, talks about putting me out for whatever reason she got. So it's going to be crazy or something like that. So I don't have nowhere else to go, but probably in the shelter. So while Taisha isn't technically homeless, she's constantly facing that possibility. And here's another mother, Kaylee, a Morris mother, who had moved out of her own mother's house with her daughter. This is when she just had one daughter, after conflicts with family members living there. And she said she had missed school because of this, because she had hit a rough thing. She says, I didn't really have a stable place I was staying and stuff, like nowhere. So this kind of stress caused significant, it was very anxious and distressing for the moms to be dealing with this, obviously. So Tania, quoted earlier, said she's the one, she had 2 kids and was always worried about not having enough food. She said she worried constantly about making ends meet. She said, I got to figure out how I'm going to spread all the money out to make sure we're stable or whatever. I get stressed all the time. Money is like always on my mind. In response to a question about whether or not she ever did things as a parent that she wished she hadn't, like I would always ask the moms, what are you proud of as a parent? What kinds of things are you proud of? What kind of things do you wish you did differently? You know, I'm a parent, I know that there are lots of both, right? And she said that happens every day because she's stressed all the time. She said that rather than yelling at her 2 young children, she would become so immobilized by her worry that she could not take care of them the way she wanted. I just sit there by myself, and I'll tell them to do everything, like make something to eat or wash up. She was especially concerned about maintaining a place to live because she did not want to go back to a shelter. I'm tired of shelters, she said. I've been in a shelter twice with my kids, and I don't want them to get in the habit of calling it their home. For Tania, the stresses of parenting in poverty often became overwhelming. She felt she had nowhere to turn for help and worried about the consequences for her children. So in our interview, actually, she started crying, talking about how alone she felt. And I contacted her a year later to see how she was doing, and we met for another interview, and her children had been taken away from her because of her housing situation. So they were living with her mother. Tania and her 2 children were living with her mother, and her mother was quite ill and in a wheelchair. And one day when Tania was out at work, her mother fell asleep. It was caring for the younger toddler son. The mother fell asleep, and the son got into some medicine. And when the mother woke up, he was unconscious. He was rushed to the hospital. Basically, DHS, Child Protection, met them there. Took the kids into foster care because Tania needed to show that she had a safe place to live. And that meant a place where the housing conditions were the facilities were okay, but it also meant that no one living there could have a felony conviction. And she said, I have other places to stay, but everyone else in my family, there's always someone who has a felony conviction, right? And if we think about, what we know about incarceration in inner city communities, you can see how this could happen. So anyway, Tania's kids were taken away from her, and when I met with her a year later, I actually met her. She was just finishing a visit with her kids. And she was extremely anxious about whether or not they were being cared for. So she said she noticed her daughter's socks were dirty. She didn't think the foster mother was changing her enough. And she thought her son seemed really hungry, and she was worried about getting him food. And actually, while we were doing the interview, she had been trying to call someone to run and get some fast food for her to give to her son. But by the time that person came with the hamburger, the visit was over. So she ended up, not having it. That's the kind of thing that, just really, really difficult situations. Other parents had a different attitude, or at least they presented themselves as having a different attitude. So Tania was really distressed. These parents, mostly mothers in the Morris program, interestingly, described also having serious financial crises, such as running out of formula or diapers, or having nowhere to live. So things that to me, as a middle-class person, seemed completely untenable. But they would claim that they didn't stress about these things. Because they knew things would work out, or they had a family member who could help, or whatever. So Wenda, in her interview, she's the one who just moved from a shelter. She said, I don't really worry about it. She talked about like all the shortages that she had. And then she said, I don't really worry about it. Like I said, long as she got Pampers, wipes, clean clothes, milk that's going to last her, and food, and a roof over her head, and a place to lay every night, that she's good. She said she felt this way because she's not really materialistic. And she explained that she had learned from spending time in the shelter about what was really important, a lesson she wanted her daughter to learn as well. So she continued, I'd rather my daughter to be healthy. So material things don't bother me. But yeah, it's times that I had like that when she couldn't provide. But at the end of the day, I show my daughter that it's not always about material things. Because I've seen a lot where I've been and the shelter these last couple months with my daughter. So I mean, times like that, it don't bother me. It just motivates me. And she actually made the same point a couple months earlier during a conversation at Morris in the parenting class. She explained that she was living in a shelter due to a domestic situation with her boyfriend. I think there was some domestic violence. But she immediately denied feeling worried about it or resentful that her family couldn't help her. She said, I'm older and I have to handle my own responsibility. And she smiled and gave this kind of decisive nod. And her daughter, this beautiful little 7-month-old, was on her lap. And she put her arms around her firmly, and she said, I just got to take care of her and me. So she was very adamant that like things were going to be okay. She could just take care of her daughter. And to me, this was mystifying, right? Like this is an untenable situation. I would be a total wreck. And I had a hard time figuring out what's going on here. But I recently read Marianne Cooper's book, Cut Adrift. Has anyone read that? It's about families in insecure times. And she talks about that some families handle extreme stress by doing what she calls downscaling, which means that they lower the bar on what it takes to feel secure. And they also emphasize kind of positive thinking. So I think that what Wenda's doing is she's downscaling. I don't need that much to feel okay. And it's interesting, another part of my study, I did work with middle-class moms in a parenting education class. And they were anxious about absolutely everything. So I would go from an interview with Wenda, who's like, well, I have wipes today, so I'm okay, to an interview, with a mom who has so many more resources and is completely falling apart with anxiety about, her daughter's sleep or whatever. It's really, really interesting. Okay, so I want to look at now how the classes dealt with these issues when they came up. As I said, the classes mostly dealt with, these other things that weren't necessarily related to poverty. There was nothing at all in the official curriculum or even coming from the instructors about food insecurity and inexpensive options. A lot of these moms, I think, didn't really know how to cook. So if you're running out of food, you'd go get a pizza. They wouldn't necessarily know that like you could cook something maybe for cheaper. Or maybe, and they also probably some of them didn't have kitchens that they could use that were functional. There was nothing about helping children with frequent moves. So if you've got a toddler and you're moving from one place to another, how do you create a space that feels safe for that toddler? Nothing about that. Even parenting within the shelter system, how do you make your child feel safe and like things are going to be okay in a shelter? How do you deal with shared or crowded spaces? How do you set up a space that's your own? And certainly, there was nothing about structural causes of poverty, like, oh, you guys are all suffering, you're all poor because our system is stacked against you in some way, or because, poverty is at this level in the city. We've had these economic shifts, and this is what's going on. There was none of that. But the topic did come up, and it was mostly when the moms raised it. Most often in their sort of side conversations. And when it did, the instructors generally either moved on to something they wanted to cover or redirected the conversation to a more individualistic analysis. So I'm going to give you two kind of extensive examples. All right. The first one is in February of 2014, this is at Second Chance, 7 mothers sat in the classroom at tables arranged in a U shape, and Miss Naomi, who was like the young, kind of hip instructor, she had placed her chair by the board at the front of the room at the front of the U. And she wore jeans and a dark button-up shirt, and her hair was newly styled in these like cool, long, loose curls. And so with her shiny hair and kind of striking makeup, she was done. She looked both stylish and comfortable, and she always sat in the same way. She would like, I don't have a chair, but she would like sit, she'd plant her feet firmly and sit like this, like ready to go. Like she felt, she was like engaged and ready to talk to them. It would make more sense if there were a chair. So anyway, she shared some information about raising introverts. She was very interested in temperamental differences. And then she tried to shift the conversation to the differences between male and female brains, pointing to a chart she had posted on the wall on the blackboard about these differences. However, rather than focusing on Miss Naomi's chart, the other participants became drawn into a side conversation between Tania, who I've talked about before, and Veronica about welfare and their caseworkers. The topic of male and female brains was completely forgotten, and this conversation took up the last 15 minutes of the class period, with Miss Naomi mostly just listening. When several mothers spoke of their own commitment to spending welfare money, the money they received through welfare, on their own children, as opposed to on themselves, Miss Naomi spoke up and said in a severe tone that not all mothers were like that, that many mothers do not put their own children first. As the class wound down, Veronica commented that when she was applying for welfare, she did not give her daughter's father's social security number because, she said, I was still with him. I didn't want to throw him under the bus. Tania then reported, with a pleased-looking smile, that she did not even want the welfare office to know where she lived. In response, Miss Naomi shook her head and mused, this conversation is offending me as a tax-paying citizen. So here she's implying that she didn't like hearing about people working the system in this way, and she's drawing boundaries between herself and the mothers, positioning herself as a member of a different social class and as someone who couldn't quite countenance the behavior of these people who were receiving public assistance. So the dynamics at Morris were different, but they also didn't touch on the structural causes of poverty, or even how to deal with it. So for example, on a chilly day in mid-November, 6 mothers sat at desks in a second-floor Morris classroom looking at Mama Odette, who stood before them wearing loose, comfortable clothes with her long dreadlocks held back in a head wrap. And the parents were talking. The conversations with Mama Odette were much looser. She was very not structured. I didn't get the sense that she prepared for class. She just kind of showed up and hugged the moms, and then they just talked. So the parents are talking about family members they knew who had dealt with homelessness. And Mama Odette said that people often give up when they face that. They end up feeling really hopeless. Wenda, who we've talked about before, she'd been quiet because all the mothers were saying, oh my God, I would die if I were homeless. I would never want to be homeless. I would do anything before I'd be homeless. And so Wenda's the one who's in a shelter, and she spoke up. She said, when I went to the shelter, it motivated me so much. It got me back on track. And so then Mama Odette looks at her and smiles, nodding in affirmation. She says, you let yourself be motivated. You knew you can't give up. The other mothers nodded, echoing Mama Odette's comments about the need to remain strong in the face of adversity. She then looked serious, Mama Odette looked serious, telling the mothers that others could judge them for having children young. This was a constant theme for the mothers. They felt judged and criticized. But they should feel proud of themselves for going back to school and doing right by their children. The mothers were riveted by Mama Odette's remarks. But what she didn't say, in some ways, is as telling as what she did. She didn't help the mothers identify concrete strategies for dealing with these kinds of issues. And she didn't talk about any reasons why these things like poverty and homelessness are so pervasive and unyielding in the United States. And maybe that's okay. In that instance, maybe that's okay. But she never really did. She never took that perspective. She also maintained this assumption that poverty and the possibilities of moving out of poverty were always a matter of individual characteristics, whether self-determination versus hopelessness. That it was your responsibility, your issue. So I know that this has been critical of the programs, and I don't want to conclude by saying that these programs are a waste of money, we should get rid of them. I think that they did serve some purpose for the moms. Some mothers did find them to be supportive, and these mothers needed every bit of support they could get. So I would certainly not argue in favor of cutting funding for these. But I do think that my findings raise important questions about the limitations of individually focused interventions in the face of really deeply structurally rooted problems. So my findings also suggest that parenting education could be more effective than it currently is if instead of starting with ideas about what parents should be doing, the program started with the conditions of the mother's daily lives and concerns. So if parenting is highly structured, right, and contextualized, then we would want to think that the interventions designed to help people do this better, more effectively, or whatever, should take that into account. Now, some criticism of parenting education has said that it's too based on white, middle-class, kind of normative notions of good parenting, and I think that it should be more culturally relevant. So people call for that, and I think that's a fair point. Although in this case, both Mama Odette and Miss Naomi, it felt culturally relevant. They used the same language. They had similar ways of talking and engaging. It didn't feel like they were kind of imposing a completely foreign way of being on these moms. But there was still this disconnection. So I actually think that it would be better to think of providing parenting education that's contextually relevant, that takes into account the context of mothers' daily lives. But the last point I want to make is to think about sort of the messages this program sends and the extent to which parenting education embodies the American tendency to, as Alice O'Connor says, individualize poverty as a social problem, locating its origins in individual behavior rather than in economic or social arrangements. And I think parenting education really exemplifies this. So it talks about individual characteristics, do you have the motivation? Do you care enough? Did you do this right or wrong? And it really doesn't acknowledge any of the structural causes of poverty. So whereas I think that some form of support and social critique of really concrete strategies for support and some form of social critique could have been helpful to these mothers and empowering, and they were struggling so much. Instead, they got class content that was really disconnected from their lives and their challenges. And they also got implicit messages that linked their poverty to individual failings. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm really interested in your thoughts and responses. Thank you.
That's excellent. Thank you. So we'll start questions. Who's first?
Thank you. Very important work.
Thank you.
Several questions. We'll just pick one. You mentioned Tania interacting with Child Protective Services. I was wondering if any of the mothers talked about how the program related to any legal things.
Yeah.
Like the terrible law in Florida where the drug testing or other legal things that were being imposed. If it helped them meet those requirements.
Right. So at these two sites, none of the mothers were there because they had involvement with child protection. In another site, where I also collected data, about half the moms were there or maybe like a third were there for that reason, and some other moms were there because they were in a kind of housing transitional program that required they go to parenting class. But when Tania had her kids taken away from her, parenting education was a requirement, but I think she was able to waive it because she'd already had it. And I think she had done lots of parenting education. And she had a really difficult time trying to get her kids back, and lots of problems with the lawyers, and no one returned her calls. And I mean, there's always more to every story, but it was heartbreaking to hear about how, and she left her kids. Mm-hmm.
What do you think would be the effects if these programs did take a historical and contextualizing approach that would be different from the effects?
Well, I think that if I'm not saying that like the classes should give a lecture on the history of welfare, but I think it would be helpful to connect it with some sort of social movement orientation, some kind of organizing, welfare rights, something else that helped the mothers feel less like failures and more like people who, like so many others, were struggling with an environment that is created not of their own, not by themselves. So I think it would have felt more empowering. I think certainly like this constant shifting of the blame from system to individuals is really problematic. But I think really in terms of making the classes better, if they had talked about strategies the mothers can use, that would have made a huge difference. And if they had, knowing that the moms really value the kind of social support, if they had provided more opportunities for the mothers to connect maybe outside of class or to have other kinds of social events, I think that would have been really useful too, because a lot of them talked about how much they loved coming and getting to share and hear from other people, but that was sort of like an unanticipated consequence. That wasn't the goal. I think it could have been more central as a goal of the program. So that's what I mean by like responding more to what the moms needed. Mm-hmm.
I hear you linking poor outcomes from the class, poor learning outcomes, to a very clear finding that the classes really, ignore their actual circumstances. And I know you're coming at it as a sociologist, and that makes all the sense in the world, but I also think it's really important to think about what kinds of approaches did they take to teaching and learning, and in what way did that contribute to sort of a failing of the class? So, for example, if the curriculum had been informed by adult learning theory, which, places a really strong emphasis on the experiences of learners, both the experiences that they bring and how that links to the experiences in the class, and also to sort of empowering adults to participate in their own decisions about teaching and learning, and all these kinds of things that are sort of more democratic, egalitarian, and more driven by the needs of the adults in the class, that might make all the difference in the world, and also would almost automatically bring in their experiences from the class. So it just seems like, you can certainly critique the classes in this way, but to not sort of take a lens of teaching and learning to the experience, it seems to me as kind of just chopping off a whole bit of informing ways of looking at why the classes didn't succeed. That's one thing I wanted to say. And the other thing I wanted to say is I think these kinds of classes are kind of serving two purposes at once for the parents. And this is true in adult literacy classes as well, which is that they serve a really important kind of social connection, social presence kind of purpose that's extremely important to the adults who participate, and yet is not what funders are funding.
I totally agree.
And so I think that's really important too, is to think about, well, what outcomes count?
Right.
What gets measured as success? And also, if parents feel better as a result of coming to courses, it might help them in small ways be better parents in ways that aren't necessarily measured by learning. But then again, when you're dealing with extreme poverty, you can't necessarily put a healthy meal on the table, and if that's like your measure of success, And then the last thing is, how open are people to learning when they're hungry, when they're stressed, So, I don't know. I just think that there's a lot of other things to think about than are we helping the adults to see their poverty systemically. Not that I think that's unimportant. I think it's very, very important because it shifts